This video is going to take us through the respiratory system notes in lecture. The first question is, what is infant respiratory distress syndrome and how does surfactant relate to it? To answer the first half of the question, the first thing that you need to know is this syndrome presents in premature babies. Once you get that part written down, let me sort of explain the why of it. The very last organ system that actually develops functionally, aside from the reproductive system, is the respiratory system. And that's because babies are fed their oxygen through the umbilical cord from the placenta from mom, so they don't need their lungs to work. However, right at birth, they need their lungs to work at that point. So if a child is born prematurely, the lungs will not have developed just yet, and that's primarily the problem that you see with infant respiratory distress. Premature babies are born with their lungs not fully developed yet. Now, describing to you what's going on in this picture, each one of these little bubbles, it's a structure known as an alveolus. Those are the air sacs that gas exchange actually occurs in. There are these specialized cells that look green in this picture. Those are called type 2 cells, and they produce a chemical called surfactant. So this is going to be the answer to the second part of the question. How does surfactant relate to it? Surfactant reduces the surface tension of water. So the alveoli inside of your lungs, they are filled with a membrane of water that coats the surface of the alveoli. That water is necessary because gas exchange can't really occur across a dry membrane, so we need it to be wet. However, water has this special feature where it likes to draw itself closer to itself. It likes to form droplets. It doesn't like to form sheets. And so the water that was spread out all over the surface of this alveolus, what it wants to do is suck itself together to make a droplet in the middle. And if it does that, it's going to collapse this air bubble. And then we're going to collapse this air bubble, and we're going to collapse this air bubble. And so what ends up happening is their lungs collapse after every breath, and that's what actually leads to the infant respiratory distress syndrome. Now, the type 2 cells are the cells that produce surfactant that reduces the surface tension of water and prevents all of that from happening. So what it means is premature babies, their lungs aren't developed. Their type 2 cells aren't developed. They don't make surfactant. Their lungs collapse after every breath. If they had been fully functional when they were born, their type 2 cells would make surfactant that would allow the water to stay as a thin film and their lungs would stay inflated. And so that was a long and drawn out thing, but it kind of shows you the lungs are more complex than what most people tend to think of them as being. Now, how does breathing relate to ATP production? So I give you a little note. This should take you back to some stuff that you should have learned in the first half of this course. We had a whole chapter on cellular respiration. We talked about this equation in that chapter. So cellular respiration takes glucose and other fuel molecules like proteins and lipids. It burns them in the presence of oxygen to generate the ATP that your cells need to fuel all the reactions that occur within the cell. So how does breathing relate to this? Well, you breathe in the oxygen that we need so we can burn the glucose, and we breathe out the carbon dioxide that we produce in this process. So your respiratory system is really just designed to help you get what you need and get rid of what you produce during cellular respiration. Let's see, that's when I give you a little note. Respiration can mean different things. So to make things simple, and I give you the same exact note in lab, breathing is not the same thing as respiration. Breathing is called ventilation. So if you are ventilating, that means you're breathing in and breathing out. Respiration for us is going to refer to gas exchange or that formula that I showed you just a second ago. And so respiration is going to be oxygen getting from inside the alveoli into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide getting from the bloodstream into the alveoli, and then vice versa at different tissues inside the body. What is a respiratory surface and where can you find ours? So the respiratory surface is the membrane that the respiratory gases need to diffuse through. Here in this picture, they're blowing up this little section right here. So this pink bubble is again an alveolus. It's the air sac that is filled with air. This is a capillary with a little red blood cell that has been cut through here in that picture. So we're going to blow up that membrane. This is the membrane, and it's made out of three things: the bubble from the lung, the lining of the blood vessel, and then a little connective tissue glue that holds those two things together. So this respiratory membrane or respiratory surface, that is the surface that we have to get oxygen to pass through and carbon dioxide to pass through. Where is this surface in us? It's in our lungs, between the alveoli in the lungs and the capillaries that surround the alveoli. What are the 3 characteristics that all respiratory surfaces must share? You can pause the video to get what you need from this. There are different types of respiratory systems. We are going to spend by far most of our time on our type because you guys don't care how a grasshopper breathes. But whether it's a tracheal system or lung or gill, this applies to all respiratory surfaces, no matter what kind of organism you happen to be. All right. What are tracheae and what types of organisms have this respiratory system? So tracheal tubes are these tubes, and if you've ever picked up a grasshopper and looked at them up close, 1, you must have been really bored, but 2, there are these little holes in their abdomen, and those little holes are connected to these tubes, and what happens is the tubes keep branching over and over again, and they end up going next to every single cell inside the body, so they are taking atmospheric air directly to every cell, so the cells can pick up oxygen from the air in these tubes, and the cells can drop off carbon dioxide to get rid of it from those tubes. So this is how their breathing is through these tubes. This is not tied to the circulatory system, which is good for them because these guys have a very inefficient circulatory system. Their respiratory system is completely decoupled from that. What types of organisms have this? Any arthropod, that is A-R-T-H-R-O-P-O-D. A grasshopper is an example of an arthropod, but that includes like all buggy things and spidery things and mites and ticks and scorpions and crabs and lobsters and a bunch of things that maybe you hadn't heard of before. Next up, we have gills. What are they? They're essentially little flaps that hang around in this little structure behind something called an operculum. This is the operculum right here. If you've ever picked up a fish or unhooked a fish, you've probably stuck your finger right in here under the operculum, which means you are touching the gills inside of there. Inside of the gills, we have lots of blood vessels. So if you've ever seen a real live fish in person, they are usually bright red, and that's because this is where their blood supply is going to be picking up oxygen and dropping off carbon dioxide. What types of organisms have this kind of respiratory system? Anything aquatic, so that can include fish. Some of our aquatic arthropods do this too, like horseshoe crabs do weird gills, but whatevs. If you go with fish, I'm pretty happy there. What are lungs and what type of organisms have them? So lungs are organs that contain bubbles that allow you to perform gas exchange. The more bubbly they are, the more surface area you have to carry out gas exchange, which means the more efficient your system is. So there are some fish that have lungs. Theirs are very rudimentary. They're not super duper bubbly. And amphibians, they get a little bit better, but these still are not great lungs. Most amphibians actually breathe through their skin because their lungs suck so hard. Pun, sorry. Okay, some amphibians you do get a little bit better. Reptiles are getting a little bit more advanced, especially some of the more active reptiles, but it's really not until you get to the mammals and the birds that you get really well-developed lungs, and that's because their activity levels tend to be a little bit higher, so they need to be better at it. After that, I gave you this picture to label, so remember, I'm talking too fast, just pause the video and get your labels, but I'll kind of run you through some of this stuff here. So, normally when you breathe in through the nostril, which takes the air into the nasal cavity. We have these little structures called turbinates that helps to collect stuff that's in the air that you're breathing. We also do have a tube back here that connects up to your ears. There's one on either side. You can just see one in this picture, but this right here is the reason why if people get a lot of sinus infections, it can lead to the ear and give you ear infections as well. It's because that tube connects up to the ears. That takes us to the pharynx, which goes all the way from here to here. Towards the front, we're going to separate and have a trachea towards the front and then an esophagus towards the back. The switching point between those two things is the larynx, which is the very top part right here, which does have the vocal cords in it. Then we get to the trachea. The trachea splits at the bottom into primary bronchi, and then our tubes just keep splitting over and over again until you end up with these really small tubes called bronchioles. The bronchioles lead to those little air bubbles called alveoli is plural, alveolus is singular, and notice lots of capillaries on the surface of the alveoli so that we can do gas exchange. Also in this picture you have the diaphragm, which is the muscle that contracts to allow us to breathe in. Next, functions for all of those parts that we just labeled. Here's what you need to know for the nose. There's more, but this is the most important stuff. Provides an airway, so most people again breathe in through the nose, breathe out through the nose unless you're super congested or something. The nose is helping to moisten air your lungs do not like dry air, and it actually makes infections more likely to occur. So you actually sort of sweat into your nose, pardon me, and that helps you to moisten the air that's coming into your lungs. You do also have nose hairs called vibrissae, and those help to catch particulate matter that's in the air, like smoke or dust or things, so that it doesn't make it down into the lungs, because again, that makes lung infections more likely to happen. And then the warm thing, again, if it's really cold outside, your lungs don't like that very much, and so warming the air helps your lungs function better too. At the very top of your nasal cavity, which is actually going to be right about here, these are sinuses, but at the top you have some olfactory nerves that come down so that you have your sense of smell. Your weird little factoid for the day as related to COVID is COVID can specifically attack these receptors and destroy a person's sense of smell. And at this point, there are people who got infected back at the very beginning of the year who still don't have their sense of smell or taste back yet. And so we're not really sure like what the percentage of people is going to be that do recover their smell and taste, because it seems to be a different length of time for different people. Okay. Oh yeah. Next, pharynx. It's the throat. It's an airway. It is also a passageway for food. So there's different sections of the pharynx. You have the nasopharynx behind the nose, the oropharynx behind the mouth, and then the laryngopharynx behind the larynx. The larynx is the vocal, or the voice box is what a lot of people call it. And that's because there are these little V-shaped structures right here. They're called vocal cords or vocal folds, whichever one you want to call them. They vibrate to produce the sounds necessary for speech, and they're located within the larynx. So vocal cords, sounds for speech. Some textbooks describe them as being pearly white. I don't see that as being pearly white, but I guess whatever. If you think that looks white, bravo to you. Okay. Epiglottis is this little blue structure right here. Now we've got this problem where we have one passageway that splits into two, one for air and then one for food and water. We need to make sure that whenever we're trying to swallow food and water that we close the airway so that food doesn't go down the wrong pipe. And that's where the epiglottis comes in. Some textbooks call it the guardian of the airway. And that's because when you swallow, the epiglottis folds down. And let me get my little marker going, because I know how much y'all love my marker. So it folds down so that it covers the opening like so, and that way your food has no choice but to go down the esophagus back there in the back. And then the place that it's at here in this picture, like that is where it is when you're just breathing, and so that opens up the airway so that you can actually breathe. Let's see, trachea, windpipe. It starts below this biggest cartilage right here. So from here down is the trachea, and really it's just a passageway for air. Bronchi split off the bottom of the trachea. There's two primary bronchi, a right and a left. They are still just passageways for air. Bronchioles are the small tubes that lead to the alveoli. They are still just passageways for air. Lots of passageway for air going through here. Then we get to the main chunk though, the alveoli. These are those little bubbles that are filled with air inside of your lungs. This is where gas exchange occurs. Now, when I say gas exchange, this is what I'm talking about. We get oxygen from our air into the bloodstream. Oh, stop being weird, clicker. And then we get the carbon dioxide from the blood into the air in the alveoli so that we can breathe that out. And so when we think about the function of the respiratory system, that really all happens in the alveoli. And so these are arguably the most important part of the respiratory system. What's the normal pathway of air into the body? Pause the video, get that. Explain the mechanics of breathing. Breathing in is an active process. And here's what that means. When it is time for you to breathe in, the medulla of your brain is going to send a signal down, and it's going to stimulate your diaphragm to pull down and flatten out. It is also going to stimulate your external intercostal muscles, which is going to lift your rib cage up and out. So this does two things. It makes your chest deeper and it makes your chest taller. All of that increases the volume in your chest. And I don't know if you guys remember Boyle's Law from high school, but if you increase volume, you decrease pressure. So you create a negative pressure area when you contract those muscles, and as a result, you suck air in. So that's breathing in. For normal breathing out, all you do is relax those muscles. The diaphragm becomes that dome again. The rib cage goes back down. That decreases the volume to increase the pressure so that you blow air back out. What is a spirometer? It is the device that allows us to figure out how much air a person can actually move when they're breathing in and out. There's different kinds of spirometers. There are some that actually hook up to a computer and they generate the graph that we're going to be talking about right here. There are some, I'll say, jankier versions where you just kind of blow into a device and it lifts a ball up and the ball kind of measures how much air you're moving. There are some that are just bags. I'm sorry, my dog is playing with a squeaky toy. Give me a second. Okay, coming back. One of the things that a spirometer can measure is something called tidal volume. And you can see that here in the yellow. Tidal volume is the normal amount of air you breathe in, followed by the normal amount of air that you breathe out. So this is one breath in and out. For the average person, that ends up being about 500 milliliters, which is half a liter of air. So when you're not thinking about it and you're just sitting there breathing, that's how much air you're moving. Next, there are other things that can be measured. This one is the one that we are going to focus on next. Vital capacity is the total amount of exchangeable air that you can breathe in and breathe out, but not just with a normal quiet breath, but with a big deep breath in. Give me your toy. Give me that. And then a big deep breath out. Give me just a second again. Sorry, dogs don't know how to be very professional. Okay, so vital capacity. You take a big, deep breath in, and then you blow out as much air as you possibly can. And so that would be all the way in, all the way out, and then back to a normal breath. This value varies very much. This is for an average man. So for women, that would be lower. For an older person, that would be lower. For a smoker, that would be much lower. But that gives you just what an average man typically is for vital capacity. Vital capacity is something that gets measured routinely from pulmonologists who are doctors who specialize in the respiratory system. Next, asthma. So my weird story for you guys as related to asthma, when I went to elementary school, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, there was one kid in my whole entire school who had asthma, and we all tortured him mercilessly because we considered him weak, and that's what kids do. Now, if you go to any elementary school, the nurse's office has a wall of inhalers because of all the kids that have asthma. It's crazy how much asthma has gotten worse, and a big, huge chunk of that is air pollution. But there's other things that play a role in relation to asthma as well. What happens during asthma, we've got these airways that are called bronchioles. The bronchioles have some smooth muscle in the wall, and for people with asthma, that smooth muscle contracts. And when it contracts, it squeezes the airway and it makes it more difficult for them to move air in and out. If you've ever seen a person use an inhaler, the way an inhaler helps is it relaxes that muscle so that it reopens the airway. So that's how a rescue inhaler does its job. It's called a bronchodilator. It relaxes that muscle. The second problem that asthmatics have, though, is inflammation. Their immune system is also going haywire, and it's causing swelling within the airway. That swelling is also going to lead to an increased production of mucus, and that mucus can also block the airway. Steroids are usually used if the immune system is leading to most of the problems there. So treatment kind of depends on how severe things are going to be, but steroids have some fairly nasty side effects, and so we don't want to keep people on those unless they absolutely need them. Next, lung cancer. It is, of course, cancer of the lungs. What you need to know about it is one of the deadliest forms of cancer that's out there, and that's because it is very metastatic, which means it spreads. And very problematically, it has usually already spread to other areas, very often the brain, before the person even realizes there is a problem. Because the lungs work so well, you can actually function with like 1.5 lungs and not notice that you have a problem most of the time. Like this person is running off about that much because these tumors are taking up about half of a lung when you add them both together. This is when he would start to be like, I might be having a little shortness of breath and go in, but now it's already spread. And so the chance of survival is very low when it comes to lung cancer. The other thing that I always like to mention for this is everybody always wants to blame smoking, and smoking does lead to the majority of lung cancers. However, there are people out there who have bad genes that just are going to give them lung cancer, even if they live the cleanest life you could possibly live. And there are people that live in places where the air is super dirty. Think coal miners or people that work in toll booths, although that's not as common as it used to be. They are more likely to get lung cancer because they're constantly breathing in dirty air. Apnea is cessation of breathing. Said another way, it's a person stops breathing. One of the more common forms of apnea is known as sleep apnea, and that's when a person falls asleep and stops breathing during their sleep. That usually, after a little bit, will wake them up, and so they will complain of feeling tired all the time. Sleep apnea is more common in people who are obese. Now, this picture relates to, I think, every parent's biggest fear when they have, especially their first baby. It is sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. The main issue that goes along with SIDS, we do not know why it happens. We do know, oh, she's really sad. Give me a second again. Okay, so repeating. I should just really start this video all over again, but I'm too lazy to do that. So we don't know what causes it. What seems to happen is that the child stops breathing, and of course breathing is conducive to life, so when they stop, it's not conducive to life anymore, and so the baby will end up dying. So this little device that you're seeing here, what they're calling the apnea monitor, it is given to families where they have already lost a child to SIDS. They know that it is a potential that can happen. And if the new baby stops breathing while they're sleeping, the apnea monitor will notice that because it's noticing the chest isn't rising and falling anymore. And so it'll sound an alarm so that the parents come in and can do some mouth breathing for the baby and try to bring the baby back. And so that's what's going on there in that picture. Pneumonia is what we have next. Pneumonia is a lung infection. It can be bacterial, viral, fungal. There's probably some protist forms of that out there. The deadlier forms tend to be bacterial. The advantage to that is we have treatments for bacterial infections. We would give you antibiotics. Viral forms, there's not a lot that we can do for you if you have it, but they tend to be a little bit less deadly than the bacterial forms are. Pneumonia will flat out kill a person because if you have an infection in your lungs, that means you have a buildup of fluid inside your lungs, which means you can't do gas exchange anymore. You're going to get really tired, you're going to fall asleep, and you're not going to wake up again. That's how pneumonia tends to work. Pneumonia is a fairly common complication of the flu. And it is something that can just really end up wiping the energy out of a person when they have it if it doesn't kill them. So pneumonia is no fun. If you've never had it, consider yourself lucky. But you can see the cloudiness in the lung on this side. That's all bacteria plus your immune response to that bacteria, which means all of this part of the lung can't do gas exchange anymore. Common cold is a viral infection. There are dozens of viruses, if not hundreds, that cause the common cold. As a result, there is not a vaccine. It's because it's not one virus that causes it. Again, it's a lot. And so there's just not, you can't vaccinate against hundreds of different strains of them. Not to mention, we don't usually need to. The common cold makes you miserable for a bit and then you get better. The only treatment for this is to lessen your symptoms. And so it's, if you have a sore throat, use some throat spray or some Sucrets or whatever helps your throat feel better. If you've got a bad cough, use some cough syrup, but it's really just try to treat the symptoms if you have it. Tuberculosis is a severe bacterial infection of the lungs. It used to be one of the leading causes of death before we discovered antibiotics back in the 1940s. Tuberculosis was also called consumption. So if you look through your history books, it'll talk about all the presidents that died from consumption. That means they really died of tuberculosis. There's two different stages of tuberculosis. There's latent TB, which means the person has it, but they are not showing symptoms and they do not even know that they have it. And then there's active TB, where the person is losing weight, they're coughing, in a lot of cases they're actually coughing up blood, and that's the stage that can end up killing a person. Tuberculosis is treatable with antibiotics. However, it is not your standard, like take a Z-Pak and you're all better. You have to be on antibiotics for at minimum 6 months if you have tuberculosis, and you'll be on at least 2 antibiotics at that time. Very often you're taking 3 or more. Sometimes the treatment can go up to 24 months, and so this is not a one and done sort of a thing. We have to treat you for a long time if you have it. There is a test to find out if you have tuberculosis, and all healthcare professionals have to have it. It's a skin prick test, so they'll prick you someplace, usually on your wrist or your forearm, and then you have to come back the next day so they can see what your little prick looks like. If it's red and swollen, that gives you a positive test. However, that test does give a lot of false positives, so the next step would be to go get x-rays to see whether or not you actually have TB, or if you just gave a false positive on the test. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It is far more likely to occur in smokers, although again, there are some genetic components. There's 2 main types of COPD. There's emphysema, which is EMPHYSEMA, which destroys the lungs. And then there's chronic bronchitis. I'm going to assume y'all can spell chronic. Bronchitis is BRONCHITIS. That destroys the airways to the lungs, like the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and so they're damaging different parts. Now, this person is displaying what is medically known as a barrel chest. With both types of COPD, it becomes difficult to expel the air that you've breathed in. Normally, breathing out is a passive process. Again, you just relax muscles and you breathe out. And people with COPD, though, they're having to get extra muscles in, and they're trying really hard to squeeze out as much air as possible, but the air ends up staying trapped inside of the lungs. And so they start to get flushed with CO2, and that starts to play around with their blood's pH. COPD is something we can slow down. There's not a cure for it, though. Cystic fibrosis is a recessive genetic condition. Usually what happens is 2 parents who are carriers get married, they have kids, 25% chance they have a kid with cystic fibrosis, and unfortunately that's what happens. Their first kid has cystic fibrosis. They have a bad chloride ion transporter that allows their mucus to be exceptionally sticky, and they make a bunch of it. Since it is so sticky, it doesn't get cleared out of the airways as easily as regular mucus, so it starts to fall and stagnate, and that makes infections very, very common in people with cystic fibrosis. Unfortunately, most people with cystic fibrosis die before they hit their mid-20s, and that's usually due to respiratory dysfunction, respiratory infection. They do also get digestive problems because the mucus is in the digestive system as well. How does smoking affect the respiratory system? Well, first, it makes COPD and lung cancer more likely to occur. Second, it destroys the cilia in the airways that help to clear the mucus out. Without the cilia, you can't clear the mucus, so you're more likely to get infections. And then 2, it damages what's known as your lung compliance. So I don't know if you guys have ever touched some lungs in your day, but lungs are very soft and they're very squishy. That means that they're compliant, and a compliant lung is stretchy, and then it recoils back to its original size. When a person smokes, they lose that compliance, which means their lung is starting to get hard. And when it's hard, that makes breathing out way more difficult. And so they're going to have to start getting those accessory muscles involved to help them breathe out. And that's when we start in towards the COPD, the emphysema that I was describing to you earlier. So it damages the cilia and it destroys the lungs itself. Can't really do the in-class activity, but we do something in lab that relates to this. So just go back to your lab stuff and we'll just sort of ignore the next part of that. How is oxygen transported? It binds to the iron and hemoglobin in red blood cells, and then it just gets transported in the red blood cells. How is carbon dioxide transported? So I need you guys to write down this formula right here. Carbon dioxide is going to go from the alveoli into the plasma, which is mostly water. It's going to react with that plasma to generate carbonic acid, which is this. Being that it's an acid, that's going to drop the pH of the plasma, which we talk about a little bit in lab 2. Carbonic acid is very unstable, and it splits into bicarbonate ion and then a hydrogen ion. Now, how is carbon dioxide transported through the bloodstream? most of it is transported as bicarbonate ion. So it's not even mostly transported as carbon dioxide, it's transported as bicarbonate ion. Some of it gets attached to the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin transports it. And then some of it is just in the plasma floating around as carbon dioxide. So there's 3 ways you transport it, but by far most of it is actually as bicarbonate ion. All right, so there is a little quiz at the back of this. It can help you to answer those questions. However, because we can't do the activity and the experiment that's on here, I'm going to create a different quiz. And so look for that quiz in Blackboard. Sorry for all the distractions on this one.